So good morning and thank you everybody for joining our webinar. My name is Lee Dupree. I'm the Managing Director of B-BBEE Novation. We're a BEE and transformation consultancy who believes that BEE truly can address most of the challenges that South Africa faces politically and economically when it's implemented properly. So your moderator for today is Melanie Vinesh. She's the CEO of the Pietermaritzburg and Midlands Chamber of Business. Those of you who've attended some of our previous webinars will certainly recognize her face because we're very happy that she always agrees to our requests, and she always does a really amazing job of moderating these panels really well. So I will also be one of the panelists today. So with that, Melanie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Lee, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar this morning. I think the best thing to do is to start with a little introduction from each of the panelists so that you know who they are. I think Lee's pretty well known to all of you. Doesn't need much more of an introduction, do you, Lee?
I don't think so.
No. So let's start with Jamil. Tell us a bit about you, Jamil.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, my name is Jamil Khan. I'm the head of projects at SAICA Enterprise Development. So I'm a chartered accountant. And yeah, essentially, we at SAICA ED believe in creating financially savvy entrepreneurs. We know that, according to the various entrepreneurship reports, 2 of every 3 businesses fail due to financial reasons. And so essentially SAICA Enterprise Development was created as an arm to the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, and we leverage our network of members to support businesses specifically in the area of finance, compliance, a little bit of funding. But yeah, I'll probably talk a bit more on that, but that's a little brief introduction. Thanks, Melanie, and thanks to all our attendees for attending.
Perfect. Tash shouldn't be a stranger to anybody either, but Tash, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Tashmir Ismayele, and I'm the CE at the Youth Employment Service. We exist to create one-year work opportunities for youth and have a legislated benefit to companies who invest in youth jobs by enabling them to get 1 or 2 levels up on the scorecard. In the past 120 weeks of operation, we have now done just on 50,000 work opportunities for youth. I think we'll go slightly over that in the next few days. And this has amounted to about 2.8 billion going into youth wallets from the private sector. Yes, as an NPO, no government funding. And so all of these youth work opportunities and salaries have come from the private sector, which is encouraging. And we had our 2nd best month since we started in February, which is a nice marker that the economy is moving.
Thanks very much, Tash. I think Kai will join us. He hasn't joined while I haven't been watching, has he?
No, not yet.
Kaya, so we'll have a little intro from Kaya when he is able to join us. I think I'd like to start with some of the comments that were attached to your profile. So Jamil, you said through enterprise development, we believe that creating financially savvy entrepreneurs will help businesses to grow sustainably across funding successfully and ultimately employ more people. Please elaborate on why you chose that particular statement.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, essentially, like I said, being part of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, we have access to, like I said, 10,000 small and medium practitioners, which are CAs in small and medium practices, and they are nationally placed throughout the country. And so, as we receive funding from the private sector for enterprise development, we see that a lot of businesses struggle with this aspect of finance, compliance, and essentially what we are positioned to do is support these entrepreneurs through our network of CAs to essentially grow and like we said, employ more people. So yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, we were part of the FinFund report, which was released, which surveyed about 15,000 SMMEs off the back of COVID-19 and the funding around that. And one of the key data points which came out of that was, 65% of SMEs highlighted that the number one item that they require assistance with in future is access to funding to grow an existing business. But we also know that about 43% of the businesses which closed as a result of COVID, about 57% of those businesses had outdated management accounts. And so it's bridging this gap between how do the businesses get access to funding when they don't have their management accounts up to date, when they don't have their compliance up to date, when they don't have, their tax clearance, their CIPC, their annual compliance up to date. It's about creating a mindset, for these entrepreneurs to maintain these records, to maintain their compliance. And we believe that the best way to do that is to connect them to a CA within our network. In terms of our programs themselves, we run a program, and after the program, most of the SMEs in the program then end up continuing with their accountant, because we also know a lot of business owners, they want to focus on their business. Their primary sort of role is to drive sales, or they believe that. And so none of the business owners really want to focus on the accounting side, nor do they have like the correct expertise in most instances. There are some business owners that are quite clued up about that. But I mean, most of the SMEs don't have the expertise in that area. So, for us, it was a bit of a no-brainer. How can we connect all these businesses up with a CA to obviously see the value that your accountant can provide, and then in the long run, adopt them as the accountant.
Now, do you believe that it's the private sector's responsibility to ensure that we grow this SME market, the private sector investment that is required to ensure that we are bringing those resources to small emerging businesses? And what is government's role in that whole scenario as you see it?
Interesting question, Melanie. Look, I mean, I think government definitely has a big role to play, and I don't think it's necessarily private sector's role alone. But I do believe, I mean, in our engagement with the private sector, they have a vested interest in, let's say, for example, developing their suppliers. Because if they have better suppliers that are compliant, that would improve their SCM processes around that. So private sector does have a role to play in supporting the economy. But yeah, I mean, government, I imagine, would have the primary role in stimulating the economy through development of small businesses. Like I was saying earlier, in terms of COVID, over 56% of these businesses don't have their compliance up to date. How are they going to access new opportunities? It's without having that initial compliance and their finances and all of that in check, because that essentially is like a business health indicator. If you don't have all that documentation up to date, then how do you grow as a business? How do larger corporates tap into using you as a supplier? So I think there's a role to play both in government and private. And there's a role to play for the entrepreneurs themselves and the business owners themselves. Yeah.
Tash, maybe I can bring you in here. You, I know, have just said that you've, through the YES program, and I think it's a phenomenal program. Got 2 young people in my office at the moment who are absolutely fantastic, and it's creating great opportunities for them. How many of those have landed up being permanent employment opportunities? They're employed for a period of time. Do they go on to be permanently employed in the economy, or is it just a matter of accumulating experience over time for them?
So the absorption rates, we were actually a bit surprised. We did a big call-a-thon. It is difficult to track youth after they finish their work experience. We had absorption rates, meaning permanent employment, not necessarily in the same place that they started at 32%. It moves every day because we have companies finishing their 1-year experience on a daily basis, and so that number moves up and down. But when we did our call-a-thon to get hold of youth that had finished a few months earlier, we actually saw the number move up to 40%. It was a big surprise. I wonder if there isn't a sample bias in that result, because given COVID and the unemployment stats, it was very surprising to see that our absorption number had actually moved up. You know, you asked a question to Jamil around government's role. And I think what's really important, and Kaya is sometimes quite stinging in his Twitter commentary around these one-year work experiences. But I think what has to be understood is that youth employment is never going to be fixed by any single entity, especially not one NPO. You know, the idea is that different entities need different roles and no one can boil the ocean. So the idea behind giving young people an entry point into the work environment has very sound sort of research-based methods behind it. We've just completed with JPAL a really fantastic employer survey where employers are telling us that 2 years of work experience in a relevant field can actually overcome their requirement for a university degree in some roles. We're seeing that if you can get a young person digitally competent in that 1 year, it serves as an incredible proxy for the abilities of that young person. Research from many countries, including South Africa, tells us that a CV and a reference letter really de-risks a young person for that opportunity and changes the outcomes of their job interview when an employer can see that they've had an experience before, completely de-risking that young person and making them far more likely to give them a chance at employment. And what we also know is that the longer you're unemployed, that scarring effect stays with you. Employers think there's something wrong with you if there's a huge gap in the time that you've been unemployed. And so this also breaks that drought for many young people. So it's one initiative in a sea of initiatives. And yes, not 100% of the youth that get the work opportunities are going to be absorbed, because what this is also doing is seeing where there's good fit. And where there is good fit, and some employers immediately call us, 2-3 months into the employment and say, we have got some incredible gems in this cohort, and we're going to be keeping these guys. When can we offer them their permanent employment contracts? And so this 1 year also gives you a chance to understand where your best fit is and what your employment fit, and helps you understand for the next job what you need to go into. So it helps the employer and it helps the employee. And I think these are things that we need to understand is no one entity can do it on its own. How do we work together? And this needs to integrate with these enterprise development opportunities as well. Because what many of our businesses are doing is after the 1 year, they're actually supporting many of these employees to go into an entrepreneurial endeavor. Setting them up with their registration, with startup funding, with the skills and sometimes the capital expenditure that they need to be able to get that business going. So increasingly, we're seeing youth moving into entrepreneurial pathways, and we do a training program, an entrepreneurial training program with them that's digitally delivered during the year as well.
Phenomenal. Lee, if I could perhaps bring you in here. You have put this together because I know you're a strong believer in particularly not only in B-BBEE, but in specifically enterprise development. Why do you think it's the silver bullet that can help South Africa?
Well, let me start by saying I agree with just about everything Tash has said. And I'm always very interested in hearing her insights on these things, because I do believe that they can shift the needle and help address a lot of the problems that we face. So to answer your question directly, Melanie, let me give you a personal example. So we as B Innovation recently landed a client, multinational e-hailing ride share service. And because of the nature of the information and the data we have to work with as BE consultants, it's incredibly confidential. And so we had to jump through hoops to be able to meet the data security requirements of this particular multinational. I was informed through this process that there are some other large service providers in the country who also struggle to meet some of their requirements. So we said to this particular company, it's going to cost us X number of hundreds of thousands of rands to be able to get to a point where we're ready to onboard properly as your service provider. And we said to them that the business decision for us would be that it wouldn't make sense for us to spend that much money for one client that we're not going to be able to recoup that amount back from over the lifespan of our contract with you. They have subsequently agreed, and now we're working on them covering the costs of those security upgrades for us so that we meet the requirements for their global headquarters so that we can become the service provider. They are going to cover those costs, and that will come out of their enterprise and supply development spend on their scorecards. So where a small business like ours would ordinarily have been excluded from being able to work with a larger player like that, we're able to leverage an element of the BEE scorecard, in the enterprise and supply development element, to be able to boost ourselves so that we can not just attract them as a client, but start working with other larger clients as well that we otherwise may not have targeted. So that's a personal example of how enterprise and supply development can be used to literally make a difference to a small business that can then help move it up to the next level.
Okay, fantastic. And now I want to ask you one of my favorite questions, because it has to be asked, and that is that don't you think these kind of good examples would happen if enterprise development was incentivized rather than legislated? I mean, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of what goes wrong, and I'm sorry Kai is not on this call, but a lot of what goes wrong is that it's a grudge payment. It's a box ticking exercise as opposed to the kind of involvement that we have here. So, I mean, what are your comments on that, Lee?
Kaya is with us now, by the way. So feel free to, so let me respond to you first. Yes, I completely agree that many companies do treat BE and enterprise development very much like a box ticking exercise. But our position has always been that when it gets integrated properly into your business, it truly can not just impact your supply chain positively, but it can ultimately give you a positive impact on your bottom line. So if you're using your enterprise and supply development spend and even integrating the YES initiative with that, to be able to develop your own supply chain, to address governance issues that may exist, to address standard or quality issues that may exist as well, you'll find that your own supply chain will be able to help you improve your own service delivery to your client base as well. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's going to mean that you're going to have happier shareholders. Now, we're only focusing on enterprise and supply development here, but the same principles apply whether you're looking at, especially on the skills development element. We've seen the recent protests with Fees Must Fall, that somebody was shot and killed in a Fees Must Fall protest. If those kinds of spend amounts were channeled better into achieving better outcomes and results, I think the country truly could end up in a far better position than we find ourselves in at the moment.
Kaya, where are you, Kaya? Come and say hello to everyone and introduce yourself, please.
Good morning to everyone. My name is Kaya Sitole, and I'm the Treasurer General of ABSA.
Great, nice to have you with us this morning. Sorry about your challenges in connecting. I think you've heard some of the conversation that's going on. He's just answered, but he's answered in the context of the fact that BE is legislated and you have to comply, and so you may as well get the best out of it. Do you believe that it should be legislated? Do you not think that there's a possibility that our lackadaisical growth is as a result of the fact that it's such a difficult environment for business to operate in, and the BEE may, in fact, by virtue of the fact that it's additional burden on business at this time, actually slow our economy down rather than allowing it to develop more organically. And if it was rather incentivized, would there not be greater buy-in from business?
Look, I think that great tension that always exists in matters of regulation is whether the benevolence of the market participants will be sufficient to achieve particular outcomes. And I think the history of what we've seen in South Africa is that an unregulated environment that relies on the benevolence of different market participants probably will get the outcomes in a much longer time span and will be much more difficult to monitor. And the tensions that I've always observed is when regulators then look at what they set out to be the objectives and they can see that they're not getting them. And the question that arises is whether a more punitive regime is what gets you there. But of course, with the punitive regime, then you see a regulator that spends more time punishing people rather than regulating a sector. So those are the types of issues that you tend to face. But on whether the cost of BEE itself and the cost of compliance is the singular burden that is influencing a lack of economic growth in the country, I suspect that you'd have to actually interrogate what exactly are the costs of compliance associated with BEE in particular. And I think for a lot of people, it will be a matter of, if you are saying that the workforce in the country, maybe the throughput from the universities is reflective of the dynamics, then there isn't an additional cost associated with finding a person who meets those demographics because the population is already getting you there. But maybe in instances of higher leadership positions where you see perhaps that we as a country haven't made sufficient investments into that particular pipeline, then yes, indeed, there may be an additional cost associated with the company having to find someone who assists them improve their empowerment profile. But I don't think that it is the single measure that we can use to simply say it is stifling business growth. I think the business growth in South Africa is stifled by a lot of red tape, and the red tape that the state puts in different ways of how long it takes to register business, for example, and the fact that sometimes when people do start businesses, they do get superseded by the more corrupt elements where suddenly the rules of the game are not as fair as you want them to be. So I do think that, unfortunately, the benevolence of market participants is not going to get us into a transformed society. So that is the basis for BEE legislation itself. And remember, legislation may just happen to be a reference point. So I can see that the legislation is there, but I'm organically doing the things that are in line with the legislation anyway. So for me, it wouldn't appear to be a burden that I have to comply with. But until you get many more businesses to be of that same mindset, it may be seen by some people as a burden. I think it is a necessary burden because the benevolence of model simply hasn't got us anywhere.
Yeah, I think it's difficult in the context of South Africa, perhaps, and it's something that's worth debating because I think in government procurement, there's a massive opportunity to spend money wisely to ensure that we actually develop SME sectors and new businesses and to actually create new opportunities. There are other countries that have used that very, very, very well, like Chile. For instance, where they have actually helped to grow entrepreneurs. My question to you, maybe Jamil, to you, is to say, here we seem to be growing a culture of opportunism. The people that you meet that are getting contracts from government are stationery providers, t-shirt printers, water people, pothole fillers, all of the above. Masters of all trades, you know, jack of all trades and master of none. How come the private sector has this obligation and government doesn't seem to have an obligation to responsibly grow entrepreneurs into successful business people? Your comment on that?
Yeah, Melanie, it's an interesting one. And I mean, just off the back of what Kaya was saying, you know, in terms of like SMEs and the challenges that they face, we actually did a report on the top 5 challenges that SMEs currently face. And one of the 2 main challenges which came out of that, and this report was done just based on like a desktop review of the entrepreneurship reports in the market at the moment, like the GEM, the GEDI, the Aspen, all of that. And primarily the first issue that businesses raise is exactly what Kaya was saying, was the red tape attached to registering a business and doing business in South Africa, and how can government play a role in easing some of that red tape. So I do believe that government has a role to play on that aspect of it. The second thing, the second big issue raised by SMEs was access to funding. And look, there's a role that we as SAICA ED also play in that space around this access to funding, where it's not necessarily the funding which is the biggest issue for these small businesses. It's actually the steps that you need to take in order to primarily access the funding. So we've seen a lot of VC funds and a lot of other funds being set up specifically on funding. But how do you get that small business funding ready? How do you get their compliance up to date? How do you get them to really look at the business model to enable it to be more scalable, whereby that funding is actually going to grow their business? And I think this is where I'm seeing what you raised now as an issue with entrepreneurs, is that, and specifically, like we had a funding accelerator program last year, and we tried to support township SMEs with the funding accelerator, but at the launch of the program, most of the entrepreneurs saw funding. That's what they looked at. It's a funding accelerator. So inevitably they ended up joining the program, but it's exactly what you're saying. A lot of their business models are just dependent on where is the next contract coming from. They don't have a scalable business model. They don't have like a proper business plan or focus for where the business is headed. It's just a case of where's the next contract going to come, and then I can specialize in that. Now, how do you, even if you do give funding, that business doesn't need funding because it's not going to grow, it's not going to scale, ultimately probably not going to create employment. So there's a bit of a role that we can play into selecting the right entrepreneurs and then putting them into the right sort of programs. So yeah, I'll just stop there for now.
Tash, I see you've posted something in the chat about support initiatives.
So we've got some exciting examples where we've been able to take our one-year experience youth, but place them into actual small businesses rather than at the big companies. This is great for these young people because these small businesses are in their community, takes away the hassle of transport, the costs of transport, security for young women to be able to get to work. And if I can, I just like to share a picture. I think that we all agree it's not just private sector, it's not just government, it's got to be a mix of both in order to see the sort of small business development that we want. I'm a big believer that legislation is needed to nudge and push people in the right direction, but you also need government, not just on the legislative side, but to create incentives for business to be able to invest. And on the business side, I think that you can't just wait for government incentives to invest. You also need to think about how this strategically benefits your business. So I'd like to give you an example of Life Healthcare. So Life Healthcare were caught with their proverbial pants down during COVID, like many businesses that had supply chains coming in from abroad. With lockdown, all your supply chains just completely got shut off. And there were a lot of products that they realized that they could actually onshore and build local production. So one of the experiments that we're doing with them is their maternity bags that get given out at the hospitals. Little Life is the name of the bag. And we got a local designer from Diepsloot that did the winning design for us. It's this denim bag that you're seeing here. And we've got a range of local producers. They're actually now making them at our Alex Hub. Working at Kluguko Designs, and 3 other designers are Yes Youth being trained in how to sew, along with those seamstresses or those entrepreneurs, own workers. So they're learning. And we've got jobs in manufacturing, jobs in packaging, jobs in distribution. And this benefits Life because everybody that earns an income in this value chain potentially becomes a medical aid user and then potentially becomes a client for them. So there's this bigger picture of how you can grow your clientele. And then also there's the immediate business picture of de-risking yourself by starting to onshore more of your production. This is entrepreneurship. And how did we fund this? Profit share partners. I put some seed funding in, you know, friends, fools, and family was generally how you start these. But then we got profit share partners to give us an interest-free loan for these entrepreneurs to be able to kickstart all of this production. And we've created a platform where we get the big orders from the multinationals and the large companies. We then aggregate producers on the platform. We assist with quality walls. We assist with efficiencies. Jamil, all the stuff you're talking about, the compliance, the workplace compensation, the insurance, we'll get all of those up to speed, assisting them so they can really focus on production and production quality. And if you can help these entrepreneurs that fully agree with the administrative systems that sit behind the business, if you can help them with really low interest rate loans, because quite often they get trapped in debt when you want to start a business. And so we've got to think about the financing forms for them. But this connection to big companies on a platform model where we can arrange all these pieces can become really successful because we've strategically linked it into a life's growth. And we're now, if you look at the bottom, you can see that we're expanding into scrubs and theatre gowns. And these hospitals are giving us their linen that they were going to incinerate. These entrepreneurs are turning them into things like shoe covers for theatre. And so we've got a lovely circular economy model going. And we've also got this Yes Fresh brand where our production in our Saldanha facility of youth sponsored by companies learning how to do aquaponics, hydroponics farming, and eventually getting the technical skills to be able to set them up in their own container farms. I seem to have lost my picture. Here we go. Here are these young people learning how to farm. We've just had a bumper crop come out and helping them with packaging and branding. So after their year-long experience, hopefully very clued up on how to move into urban agri as a career choice. And that's just some ideas on how we mix legislative. All of this was funded by enterprise development money. How do we mix BE scorecard funding with corporate strategy and building jobs into those value chains? But you do need to create an ecosystem of players. You know, Yes brought in the blueprints, the relationships with the corporates, profit share partners brought in the interest-free loan. And then we've got another small business that helps us with the efficiencies and qualities and administrative parts of getting those businesses going.
Absolutely phenomenal. And I think those kind of projects, there are a lot of good stories like that. And there could be a lot more stories like that. My question to you is, and you say you're a firm believer in it being legislated, but if you look at human nature, you tell me that I have to do something, or even if it is something good, I'm going to resist it. If you sell me a phenomenal idea like you've just presented, and I reach out into my pocket and do it out of the goodness of my heart, isn't there a more favorable result the second way? And you know, if you look at the figures now, I mean, we've become a less equal society than we were before BE was instituted. I just happen to be a firm believer in the goodness of people, and particularly South Africans. I've gone into a lot of companies where I've seen the most phenomenal things unfolding just organically because they're passionate about South Africa. You don't think that it actually gets in the way of some of that stuff because you're told you have to do it?
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so sometime last year, I actually had to write an article about the fine that had been given to Steinhoff and Marcus Justem, and the fine that had been given by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority was 53 million rand that had been reduced from over $1 billion. And similarly, with the JSE having come up with a fine that was regarded as minute, And a lot of people then complain to say, no, but this man lost people billions, so why is the fine only a fraction? And I had to be at pains to explain to people that when we set regulations, we do not set them for the outliers, but you set them for the general market out there. So you, Melanie, and I may be strong believers in doing things out of the goodness of our hearts, out of our own volition, but the data indicates that the general business community, which is who you want to actually target, do not share those sentiments. So of course, in the absence of us being able to put our strong belief in a system and us organically doing things, in the absence of that being the universal consensus, legislation is actually the key driver that enables you to at least set the parameters and then track people on an objective basis. Because if we said in the absence of legislation, let us rely on our own sense of commitment, your sense of commitment towards a particular sector may be much greater than mine, your sense of belief in what ought to be done may be much greater than mine. So it becomes a very fluid exercise when we then have to try and firstly understand the sense of conviction and then try to craft an economic pathway on the basis of that. So I do believe that in the absence of legislation, we'd be hoping that there are many more people like you, but unfortunately, the essence is that you probably are an outlier in your conviction that actually things can happen.
I don't know about that. I'm working with a lot of businesses and I see the most amazing hearts. I think they're very often the people that make the news are the people that, that might very well be outliers. Let's talk about investment, because I think that's, I haven't been to a single international B2B meeting where BE hasn't been brought up as a deterrent to investing in South Africa, because investors, let's face it, they've got money, they want to put it in where it's going to make money. That's how business works. And if you make the environment too difficult for me to actually operate, then I'm going to choose somewhere else. That's the basic premise for it. So my question to you is, we haven't seen, if we look at the results of B-BBEE in the last 10 years, say, we haven't seen the results we anticipated. We've seen some people get ridiculously wealthy, and generally people on the ground have really not benefited from the legislation to the extent that was expected, or it's debatable whether it was expected when it was created, because we know who created it. But we haven't seen those results. It is a deterrent, undoubtedly, as far as investment is concerned. My question is around the fact that this is a societal issue that we South Africans desire to address to ensure that we have a more equal society. And I don't think that that's something that is even debatable, that is what we want. But it's a thing that we want. It's not a thing that should be visited on investors necessarily. So if it is, should we not make it a tax incentive to say, as a company coming into South Africa, you'll pay this great tax rate, that's the standard, but if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll lock off this amount of tax and that amount of tax, and reward people for taking initiatives to achieve an aim which is ultimately ours. So my question is legislation, punitive legislation, the answer? Or should we be looking at something that's more of a carrot rather than a stick? I don't know who wants to take that.
I would argue that yes is a carrot. You know, if you invest in these one-year work experiences, you can move up on the BE scorecard. And I think companies have responded really well to a carrot model. Nobody likes punitive measures. They don't work behaviorally. They don't encourage the behaviors that you want. I do think what we need to do is get a lot cleverer at showing companies, showcasing best practice models of how, when you design good business models with BE at their heart, because in my experience, BE is actually really good business practice if you do it well, if you do it strategically, if you really say this is there to expand and grow my business. You can use it. You can, especially with mass market segments, the kind of customer loyalty you can build if you build models that grow incomes in communities. You really have a winning model. So I think we need to get better at showcasing how you can do this well. Having more industry lead companies publicizing the way they do business with good BE. That could go a long way in taking the fear of not knowing how to do this, because a lot of companies are taken for a ride by unscrupulous agencies, consulting agencies, that actually make BEE cost them a whole lot more money than it needs to. Because they're intimidated by the legislation and feel that they need a master's to be able to understand it, they bring consultants in, and quite often, you know, the actual beneficiaries get the short end of the stick here, because so much money sort of leaves through the administration of these funds. And so good, well-priced BEE models would also help incentivize companies. I do have to agree, though, that some kind of legislation, even if it's a positive behavioral reinforcement, does need to be introduced. However, there is a lot of jadedness we're seeing in companies around BEE because there's been so much poor BEE conducted. And so I think it needs a rebrand. It needs a refresh on how this can be positive. Because we've had some very troubling remarks made by companies saying we're just giving up on this thing. It really is not having the impact that we want. And that's obviously not the way we want it to go. So I think to rescue it, good examples, good branding, and positive reinforcement. I think your idea around a tax incentive is a brilliant one. Because just from a behavioral perspective, we know that those work in a much more constructive way.
Yeah, thank you. Jamil, you've been very quiet. What are your thoughts about an incentive as opposed to kind of, I guess, prohibitive legislation? If you look at the psychology of people, if people think it's their idea, they're usually more committed to the idea of it. And in this current environment, let's face it, so many businesses are just battling to survive. They're saying, you government are making it just about impossible for me to operate. You and your Eskom and your load shedding and your infrastructure failures and your high taxes and your bad roads and your increasing tolls, you make it impossible for me to operate. Now you don't have to comply with any of the legislation that you're putting in place. You're actually not helping us grow entrepreneurs, but you put all this punitive stuff on us to make it even more difficult for us to operate. Is it not better to say, we understand you businesses must get on with the business of making your businesses survive so that you can grow our economy, and these are the things that we want to achieve, so we're going to offer you these great tax incentives if you deliver what we agree should be delivered for our country. And the more people do it, the more invested they are in the projects that they undertake, because it's their idea and it's voluntary.
Thanks, Melanie. Look, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think in recent years, I know the CIPC has taken steps to try and automate workflows to register companies. So there are certain things happening, you know, the creation of the Biz portal where you can register a company from start to finish with your workman's compensation, with the bank account, with everything, you know. So I think there are people looking into how to streamline business registration. But I think it's primarily maybe the issue is post that, you know, like who gets access to the work, you know, the more connected people then benefit, you know, from the bigger tenders and stuff like that. I think primarily there might be a big issue. And yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to answer. I know that, you know, the tax, there is small business tax that was introduced for SBCs or small business corporations. By no means am I a tax specialist, but I mean, I know when I studied, there were some sort of incentives created for like small businesses to not pay so much tax, you know, at inception and the initial years of business. But I think then, you know, perhaps the question is that working? And how can like SARS or major players in the tax sort of realm, how can they really look at creating these incentives for small business or adapting the current incentives for small business? So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think maybe exactly what Tash was saying was have like a double approach where you keep the legislation, but then just look primarily towards the incentives and how we can adapt measures to actually benefit small businesses in a much larger way. Yeah.
So there's this incredible model that was adopted in Chile some years ago by the Chilean government, and it is a government procurement system, but it's quite interesting because they awarded the tender to the National Chamber, which meant that every business had to go in and register with the chamber, and they were assessed in terms of their level of capability. They had to put all their legislative certificates, upload them to the system, etc. And then every time there's a national or a provincial or local tender, it goes out to all those people that qualify to tender for it. And then obviously there is a computerized system that allocates the work, and then there's an assessment after that. So you can't progress to the next level unless you have met the requirements in order to be able to do that. And you can't have fly-by-night people that change who they are every 5 minutes and just open and close businesses left, right, and center. So it's quite a nice managed system, and it allows you, when you've reached a certain amount of competency, to then apply for a training program that allows you to go up to the next level. So it's quite a proactive government system, which also allows people to gain experience that is then properly vetted, giving you the experience to get private sector work. So it has grown the SME market quite phenomenally. Do you not think, Lee, that government has a very important role to play in this space in terms of developing new businesses, giving them the opportunity to develop a sound reputation, so that when they're on the system, they're vetted both by government and private sector, and then the taxpayer gets good bang for their buck. We're growing businesses organically, and we're allowing them to become bigger businesses and new ones to enter the system. It's been exceptionally successful. Your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with you, Melanie. I think if the South African government were willing to implement that sort of system, it would make a huge difference to the outcomes. And in fact, enterprise and supply development could be linked very well into that. However, the problems we would face, and I think we all know this, is that it's going to close off the taps to those politically connected few who are currently siphoning off that tender system. And so there isn't the political will to make those kinds of changes internally. So as much as we can see the value of it, I don't think government is generally, on a good day, very creative at some of the solutions it implements, which is why I think that private sector driven initiatives like YES just operate so much more efficiently and effectively. I wouldn't trust government, unfortunately, to be able to solve that kind of problem, even if the solution exists in another country. On incentives, there was the Brenthurst report that, and quite a number of years ago, that also spoke to tax incentives for BEE. So I fully support that potential solution as well. But while I have the floor, Melanie, I'm just going to respond to one of the questions in the Q&A, where it asks about the billions of rands that have been injected from the private sector into enterprise development, and yet we're yet to see a significant impact. So I had an ENCA interview post-SONA where the issue of BEE came up. And one of the solutions I recommended was to try to get more effective use of enterprise and supply development spend. What I would recommend is that more light be shone on it. So what do I mean by that? So I think that companies should have to report on who their ESD beneficiaries were and what those outcomes were. And I think that if we're able to measure and manage the enterprise and supply development beneficiaries and what that money actually achieved, I think we'll start to see a far better outcome on that particular spend. So yes, a lot of that ED money is spent as tick boxes. And to Tasha's point about rebranding BEE in a better light, when we have clients who implement really amazing and fantastic ED projects, one of the things, or even socioeconomic development projects, one of the things we try to encourage them to do is to get some media attention on it. We've sometimes had clients featured on national news for some of those, but the problems that we find is some of them prefer not to because they're afraid of what that might mean for them, possibly politically. or sometimes that too much attention might actually cause them more harm. So I agree with rebranding BE, but sometimes some of the experiences we face, because we certainly encourage our clients to tell their good news stories, but we do come up with some roadblocks sometimes.
Hi, have you got any thoughts on what's been suggested?
I think we've always suffered from this problem where the ideals of whatever policy gets put into place pale in comparison with the, when contrasted against the poor implementation of it. And I think the different models that have been ventilated here are probably all the things that we could all agree would make a difference. But again, if the common variable is going to be a government that has a poor track record of implementing anything, Melanie, it doesn't matter how many bright ideas we come up with, you know very well where it's going to end up being stalled and being paralyzed. And that, of course, is the great problem here, in that even in relation to BE itself, you probably don't need to change a single variable or a single aspect of it, but to be able to monitor it adequately. And if it turns out that indeed an incentive system is what gets you moving forward and what gets you to realize the type of gains that you envisage, then that's what we should be engaging on. But I do think that experience that we all have in our individual and collective capacities is that I can give you 10,000 brilliant ideas, but if the state's capacity to implement any of them properly still doesn't exist and is still not being cultivated or developed, then it actually does become a stillborn exercise. We're seeing a lot of success in what I regard as parallel structures. So Tashmir's Yes initiative, for example, is something that emerged outside the traditional government structures. And here she is, she can tell you exactly how many people have been part of it and what the absorption rates are. So at least people would have a much greater sense of faith in an initiative like that. We saw similar activities last year in relation to the Solidarity Fund, where at least people could track. You can log on online, you can see how much came in, what is being utilized for. And sometimes that level of transparency assists people having faith in the system. But unfortunately, what big government tends to do is that a lot of these things get swallowed up by the bigger structure, and you can't even track your own inputs and your own participation in it, which really makes it very difficult for people to assist them. So yes, how many big ideas we can come up with? Tons of them. Can they be implemented under the current paradigm? Absolutely no.
Yeah, and I think the biggest frustration is obviously felt by the small businesses themselves who are looking in every direction for help. I mean, I haven't met a single small business that's received some assistance from our National Department of Small Business. I'm not sure how effective their programs are being, but I know a lot of people have applied and have not been successful in getting any support from them. Some of the questions that I have, Jamil, maybe for you. In Australia, there was a really phenomenal small business advocacy campaign that was run. It was called Small Business Too Big to Ignore. And they just came up with 5 particular things that they found were creating problems for them in their business. One was a red tape issue, but instead of saying there's too much red tape, they made specific suggestions. You know, stop expecting us to submit tax returns until our income's over a much higher level. It's too punitive, all the stuff you have to fill in. Don't expect a registration or whatever it is. That what are the areas where you believe there could be immediate relief from a removal of red tape? And then some of the others were around labor issues, and maybe that's something that the Tash can deal with afterwards. The one particular thing that they were saying is that small businesses that are, for instance, hairdressers or plumbers, having to pay staff time and a half on a Saturday and double time on a Sunday means that they can't operate on a Saturday and a Sunday because they just can't recoup the kind of money that allows them to stay open. So they asked the Australian government to allow them up to a certain level of business, to allow them to have a standard rate of income, because they could employ twice as many people, you know, extra people on a Saturday and Sunday as a normal thing, and keep their businesses open and therefore grow. So these are the kind of things that small business should collectively be advocating for, and maybe advocacy intervention is one of the things that would help them. Your thoughts?
100%, Melanie. Yeah, I totally agree. I think at SAICA, the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, because a lot of the small businesses directly deal with their tax practitioners or their CAs, there is a specific advocacy arm in the tax unit at SAICA, which essentially, exactly what you're saying, collates different ideas, or I imagine it's hypotheses at that point, you know, on how, you know, we can enable small businesses to pay less tax or benefit from tax incentives and the like. But I think just adding to what Kaya was saying, you know, there's only so much that SAICA can present to the South African Revenue Service. And you know, the outcome or the action that comes out of that, you know, we generally don't. I mean, I suppose we do play an important role as a stakeholder, but you know, what's government's tolerance level around allowing small businesses to tap into these incentives would be a totally different question to ask. You know, so I do know, just to summarize, I do know that this sort of stuff is happening. You know, feedback from because your small and medium practitioners are small and essentially small businesses. You know, your 1 or 2 man firms are doing these small levels of revenue, and so have a vested interest in figuring out or putting forward suggestions. You know, and I mean, the CAs that are in the tax space would have the best knowledge on the Tax Act, and there are various committees set up to provide insight specifically on the stuff. But whether or not these presentations that go to government are then taken up, I don't know. I can't comment on that. But I do think it is a good idea, maybe not specifically at SAICA, but from a more broader level. You know, exactly what was done in Australia can be recreated on our end, because you know, we don't necessarily know it all either. You know, so yeah.
Maybe there's pockets of information that are sitting in all sorts of places. So I mean, if you had to choose 3 changes to, I don't want to put you on the spot now, but 3 changes to tax legislation or company registration legislation, just 3 red tape issues that are major, could majorly change the landscape for small business, what would those be?
Sure, that's a difficult one to answer on the spot. But maybe some sort of tax break or incentive for the first 2 years of business operation, you know. Would that fundamentally be good for small business? I don't know, because you get businesses that start off, I mean, you do get like the assessed loss. So if a business starts off and starts generating losses, it can then forward on that loss to deduct against future tax income. So that does exist, but I don't know. I'm going to put a pass on that question.
Cash.
Well, Melanie, I'll be willing.
Go ahead, Lee.
I'd be willing to give my opinion as a small business, and I'm cognizant of the time as well. So just very quickly, an inordinately large amount of my time gets spent on compliance, tax and other compliance. If SARS can just make life easier for us somehow and pay us our refunds when they owe us instead of making us have to fight them, that would be an extremely supportive measure government could implement.
Yeah, okay, I think I'm going to just take some final comments from everyone, because I'm aware that we're teetering on the end of our session here. But I think just to sum it up, maybe just some thoughts around the fact that it is absolutely critical that there is some kind of intervention on behalf of small business. Your thoughts on whether BEE legislation as it exists and the enterprise development component of it, could it be separated out from BEE? Is BEE in its existing format the way we should go forward? And is there some, should there be some appetite for people collectively to take that knowledge and to unite small business throughout the country so that they can advocate for the changes that would enable them to be more successful? Let's start with you, Kaya.
Look, I think you probably are hitting it on the head there, in that one component of BE, which is supplier and enterprise development, is such a fundamentally important one. We probably need to be able to have the instruments that enable us to proactively monitor and engage what the gains are in relation to that. Because I think what you'll find is that what makes it unique is that generally there are institutions that then say, well, if we're doing some enterprise development, it is outside our normal, scope of operations. It is not something that is happening in-house. It's not employment equity, for example. So what that does is that it may amount to people taking a less than active interest in actually seeing it working out. So they'll simply say, we spent an amount of money, but if we're not seeing the gains, if we're not seeing the growth in that sector, it means that some of those amounts spent may not be spent optimally. So I do think that it is probably something that we should have a very amplified focus on and say, how are we doing it? How better can we do it so that it become a great multiplier? Because I think in relation to other components of BE, this is the one that not only deals with one business, but can create another new business that may eventually become this of the same size and scale. So I think that it is a valid proposition. Thank you.
Fantastic. Tash?
I think that, you know, just to summarize today's, that we're closing, you know, given that we're closing, I'm going to just reiterate the point. It's not one organization, it's not government, it's not business. We've got to get a range of players working together on platforms to be able to drive this. I also want to make an appeal, a human appeal. Those of us working in this space, this is hard work. You are fighting an uphill battle every day with a system that is designed to exclude. There are enough monsters out there to go after without targeting each other. If all of us that play in this space are allowed to do our bit without the expectation being that any of us individually is going to be able to solve this, or any of our organizations is going to solve this, working together in these ecosystems, what part can I play? What part can you play? How do we integrate? How do we put combined pressure on policymakers and legislators to make this an easier job? But to those listening in, get in the ring. Don't stand on the sidelines, criticize, say the system doesn't work. Step in and work with us. And to the rest of my panelists, thank you so much for fighting the good fight and doing the amazing work that you do. I hear you and listen to all of your suggestions because you're in the ring getting dirty. And that's the only way we're going to solve this. We've got to keep trying new ways. We've got to fail sometimes, try another angle. But the answer definitely lies in the connection of our organizations and institutions to deliver on this. BE does need to be rebranded. There is an exhaustion around it. But this doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a way to reinvent the brand of BE, and that's by showcasing really exciting models, that it's not the legislation that pushes you to do it. It's because it makes good business sense to do it. And let's highlight a lot more of those examples.
Absolutely, completely and utterly agree. Jamil, what about you?
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I love what Tash just said. You know, it's about working together, especially us who operate in this space. You know, I mean, we bring different strengths to the table, and I think essentially, if we can find a way to work together in exactly what Tash was saying, that makes good business sense. You know, like partnering with an organization like SAICA would enable things like accountability and ethics. You know, to be at the forefront in terms of the program. You know, our specific area is specifically on the financial side of things, whereas yes, we bring a different element to it, and different other partners bring different elements to it. And I think figuring out a way to collaborate and work together, you know, we should be able to enable small businesses to succeed in the BE space and in our country. You know, so thanks.
Fantastic. I know Lee's going to want to have the final word and close. So before I hand over to you, I'm just going to say that one of the things that always impresses me about the Chinese is that they will implement a policy and then they will do a lot of checking to see whether it's having the desired results. And if it isn't, they stop and they make adjustments and they change it. There's absolutely no point in continuing to do the same thing that isn't delivering the results that you want it to deliver. It doesn't make any sense. So we do need a rethink, and we do need to put our heads around what would actually work better. So thank you so much for the contribution that each and every one of you have made today. Lee, you're going to have your final contribution. Thank you for the invitation to join in the discussion this morning. I really appreciate it. Wish you everything of the best with your endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to all the panelists. And, you know, one of the solutions that we think would help resolve some of the problems is perhaps a weighting on the ownership element, where if somebody reaches a certain net asset value in their personal capacity, that they shouldn't count for as many points on the BEE scorecard. That, with tax incentives, I think certainly would make a very big difference, as well as opening up enterprise and supply development. Like I said earlier, let us know who your beneficiaries are. What were the outcomes that you achieved? But certainly there's no country in the history of the world that's been able to grow itself economically without addressing its skills issues. South Korea is one of my favorite examples. I've been twice to see firsthand, and it's amazing to see how much they've been able to grow in a few short decades by focusing on skills development. BEE has an element that that helps solve some of those issues. But on enterprise and supply development, the reason we've collaborated with SAICA is because when lockdown first happened about a year ago now, and the government incentives, as well as tax incentives, were implemented, we realized that there were many small businesses who were unable to access those because they couldn't, they didn't comply. They didn't have management accounts, they weren't tax compliant. So we've developed an enterprise supply development solution in collaboration with SAICA, where we help address that exact problem. So I know there are some people in the audience who come from pretty large organizations. If you'd like us to help you channel your enterprise and supply development spend better into helping to address those issues and incorporate it better into your value chain in a way that makes more sense and gets you better outcomes on your bottom line, please do talk to us. And with that, thank you again to all the panelists, and thank you to all the guests. This will be posted online for anybody to access on our YouTube channel, so please do like our social media pages and continue to engage us there, where we'd like to hear from you. And I'm sorry we weren't able to take some of the hands and respond to all of the questions, but unfortunately we're a little bit over time. But thank you again, everybody, and I hope that you have a great day further.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.